And a fundamental misconception there, Shiraz, is to see your fundamental rights, whether they're under 14, 19, 21, as something that's a gift. It's not. It's not. No government gave it to us.
Welcome to the Bombay Bar Association podcast. I'm Shiraz Rustomjee, and our guest today is one of the most charismatic, colorful, and respected members of our association, Justice Gautam Patel, retired. When Justice Thurgood Marshall, one of the greatest judges of the US Supreme Court, was asked how he would like to be remembered, he said, as a man who did what he could with what he had. I believe that applies in spades to our guest. Whether as a lawyer or as a judge, Justice Patel certainly did what he could with what he had. And as you will see, what he had was quite exceptional. Let's begin at the beginning. I believe you grew up in a house full of kids, including your cousins.
I don't know how my parents managed it, but they did. And it was quite extraordinary because we got to do a lot of things together, including one absolutely legendary trip in a converted telco bus, which had been adapted by one of my father's friends into a caravan and a trip through Gujarat and Rajasthan. It was absolutely incredible in the days before Google Maps, relying on articles from Marg magazine, I think. So finding new places to go to for 10 or 12 days. It was quite an extraordinary experience. But it was a lot of fun in the house.
That seems kind of reflective of how your parents really kind of brought you up. I mean, that's unusual.
It is unusual, and they were very liberal. They were very liberal in the ways that mattered. They didn't control what you read. There was a lot of emphasis on learning, on reading, on just being your own person and recognizing the individuality in everyone. So one of my cousins had a more scientific bent of mind. The other one was more artistically inclined. This was all allowed space and freedom. It was wonderful in that sense. It was a large enough house to accommodate everyone. But it was difficult for them, I think, because they had to plan holidays in a way where they could sort of delegate 8 people to someone, which is never an easy thing to do. And they delegated to their closest friends, who were even more liberal. So my mother would come back to a completely destroyed house. It was fun.
Your father, Shirish Patel, is not only a well-known structural engineer. I mean, he is, I believe, the chief engineer on the Kemp's Corner flyover.
Yes.
And also has worked on the High Court building, I think.
But he worked on some of the repairs that were essential at that time.
That's what I mean. What sort of influence was he?
Oh, outsized. His interest was also in civil engineering in the broadest sense, which is civic engineering, town planning. He was one of the 3 who proposed the twin city across the harbour, Vashi, with a co-authored article in Marg. And he was
so much more than a structural engineer.
Oh yeah, and he actually had held a position with CIDCO as a public servant with a sort of lateral entry for 5 or 7 years as the chief engineer there when Navi Mumbai was taking off. But he was driven, I think, by a sense of equity and justice, even if not so explicitly stated, in the designs and the concerns and the plans and how these were being operated. Plus, there was that scientific approach to this. I mean, they've got about 20-odd patents on various things in civil engineering. So there is that aspect of it as well. Had a significant aesthetic sense. I was deeply interested in art from his days in Cambridge. So all of this was laid out for you, if not specifically, but it was just there. And then it was up to you to help yourself.
You came close to going to film school.
Yeah, one of those things that happened at that time was that I just fell in love with cinema as an art form. And I was watching like 5, 6 films a day: Japanese cinema, Polish cinema, South American cinema, Italian cinema, reading everything I could on film, James Monaco.
So
How
clearly
to
your
Read a
film phase.
Film phase. Bit nutty at that time. So I used to sort of go around doing this, a little idiotic, and then people would laugh at you and stuff.
Yeah.
And then on a sort of lark, I applied to the Film and Television Institute. I'm very glad I didn't get in, because would have massacred whatever I did there, I
So
think.
clearly you sort of stumbled into law.
Well, you have to blame Sham Devan for that, because, we'd been friends since childhood. Our families have known each other for a long time. And he said, listen, there's something happening at this government law college place. Can we go? Want to come? So I said, fine. I don't think I knew whether he'd said moot court or mock court or whatever it was. And then walked in and saw this. And, Shavak Sajidar was one of them, and Soli Cooper was one, and Tushad Cooper was another, and others like this. And I saw this thing happening, and I said, I want to be part of that. So
What was that thing?
I think at that time the whole well, first of all, there was the whole ceremonial theatricality of it, which was attractive and seductive in itself, but also the fact what they were doing, which was this persuasion with language, with words, and with reason. And I think that was what was really attractive. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was certainly undeniably attractive at that point.
So after you pass out of law college, you
Yes.
started practice with a firm, D.H. Nana.
Well, he's a sole practitioner. He was a very close friend of the family. Sole practice as a solicitor. His wife, Sohini, was a counsel, later became senior counsel. I started with him actually before law college started, and started the dispatch
you
desk.
worked with him right through law college.
Right through law college. And it was terrific because he had a sort of swashbuckling personality when it came to law. And his persistent advice to clients was, first do what you want to do, then we'll see, which was unusual for the most part. And this was tempered with an enormous sense of humor and delight in the absurd. Never let go of
He
that.
liked a good chuckle.
He liked a good chuckle, and he was the ultimate in liberalism when it came to, can I do this? So never, don't do it, this is not the way it is done. He'd correct you if it was it was wrong, but he'd pretty much let you run the course. I remember in one messy litigation, he let me handle the correspondence. I was having a lot of fun with it. Mr. Mahendra Gilani was on the other side, who has great sense of humor also. We only carried the correspondence because both sides were enjoying it vastly. But Dharmasukh let me carry this forward. It was a great learning experience, really.
So again, somebody who's basically telling you take the call.
Well, at that time, what happened was that Sham Chainani of the Bombay Environmental Action Group came in. This was the first clutch of those BEAG cases. And they wanted a lawyer, solicitor who would do the filing. And Dharmasukh said, I don't have the time, but I'll do it free, but I won't have the time. And I happened to be there and said that, you tell me when you need guidance, but you have to do the nuts and bolts of it, which was a terrific learning experience. Because
You were happy to do this?
Oh, I loved it. Got into the writ thing and got into working with people like Atul Setalwad, Navroz, Rajni, all of them, Zia Modi, were all there in those early BAG cases. And we were moving before courts like Justice Manohar, Justice Pense, and so on and so forth. So it was really a very exciting time,
Tell us a bit more about your work with the BAG and the environmental, the stuff you did there, because that was quite considerable.
Yes, it was. And, one of the things that Dharmasukh did at that time is that he said, I don't want you to keep coming back to me. Now, remember, in those days, this was without cell phones, without all the connectivity that we now have. So there was really meant going back to the office to ask a question, then coming back to court, time spent. So he said, I want you to take the call there and then. So that freedom to take a strategic decision in court was a tremendous learning experience at that time. And it made a difference in the non-BAG work. But even in the BAG work, Atul would have these conferences in chambers in the annex. What is to be done, I'd follow. Dharmasu couldn't interfere very much. This then evolved into more engagement with BAG as an organization. And when I began practice, this became quite a significant part of my work. I think it was perhaps inevitable because I'd been doing it even before.
Plus, that was early days for environmental law in the sense that things were being developed.
That's true. And there were moments of delight there because we often drew ferocious opponents, people like Aspi on the other side. And I remember one of the great high moments was some petition that Samir Mehta and I had worked on. There were others, one with Devi, Asham, Samir. And we walked out of the chief's court, and Aspi was on the other side. And he says, that was a very difficult petition to answer.
Cloud nine for a week.
Cloud nine for a week. I mean, you hear someone like Aspi saying this to you, it's just a terrific feelings.
So from there, the chambers of first Iqbal Chagla and then Janak Dwarkadas, both titans in the field.
Yes.
What was that like?
Janak's influence was phenomenal, but I think in ways that he never fully understood. It's just because he's the way he is. When Mickey asked whether he'd take me on, he said, how can I? I'm not this, that, the other. I was his first junior. But with Janak, there were two or three things, well, not two or three, there are actually far too many things, that you began to understand. One was that commitment to something beyond the brief and the interest, the strategizing, the commitment to the profession and what the profession and its ethical standards demand of you. This, it's easy in this profession to slide and fall off and take the shortcut. Never take the shortcut. Janak had a pathological inability to say no to anybody who sent him a brief. He'd slaughter himself even in the most difficult and the trying circumstances, whether with the family or otherwise. But I've seen Janak, for example, travel from Pune, wherever he was, and on maybe 3.5 hours sleep, argue in that first floor court for 5 hours, and really must have been dying on his feet. But that commitment to the cause was just there. So that's an enormous thing.
You were the secretary of this association, and you did a lot of work not only in kind of updating things, bringing things up to speed, but also in terms of generally kind of developing the role of the society and taking it forward. How do you see, what importance do you see the society actually having? How do you see its role?
Look, I think every association for lawyers is important. But the Bombay Bar Association, one of the three in our High Court, is really significant because of its history. And that, to a large extent, will tell you about where it can and should be able to go. If you look at those minute books which we rescued and then have had preserved, there is almost an unbroken story of the bar standing up for the bar, even against judges, certainly in public life. The engagement with public life, because many of these figures were people from public life. Bhullabhai Desai, Firozshah Mehta, all members of the bar. There are long mentions of Ambedkar in our minute books. The singular focus of the Bar Association today could be on more training for advocacy because the challenges are becoming more and more difficult. teaching and instruction per subject because our laws are becoming more complex and intricate, and doing this in a structured fashion, which I believe they are doing with advocacy, for example. And these are essential things outside the law schools that lawyers would greatly benefit from. So I think it's uncharitable to see this as just a physical meeting space or a tea room
Or a talk shop.
Or yeah, it's much more than that. It's much more than that, and I think they've carried it forward quite well. I think they've really carried it forward quite well.
What led you to become a judge? And were you keen to become one?
No. Led, keen, wrong words. It's an invitation. Would you consider it, is how it's usually put. You are encouraged not to say yes immediately, but to check with the family, because it's never just about you. It's about the family as well. And nothing really prepared me for what followed afterwards. But the saying yes part of it was actually quite intricate. You had to first resolve it with yourself. As a friend said, remember, this is a decision that's irreversible. You can't choose the work that you do, you can't choose who you work with, and you have to be able to last the course. And the challenge then was whether you'd last the course with the same enthusiasms, the same keenness, the same interest that guided you when you said yes. It was never easy. Back home, some level of consternation. Malu was really very good.
That's
My
putting
wife
it
was very
mildly,
good.
I'm sure.
Was very, very sweet about it. She says, well, if you...
You did say Malu is your wife.
Yes, yes. If you really want to do that, we'll make the space for you. Of course, in a lighter vein, she used to say that, well, he's now out of the way, so I can get on with my life. But anyway, the parents were very supportive. My mother said, I don't want you to leave the house. We were living upstairs, downstairs, still are. And my father very quietly said, I realize that there will be financial constraints, but don't worry about that, which was enormously reassuring as it happens. And these were factors where this family then gave you sufficient platform and latitude to go ahead and do this.
Did anyone give you any kind of advice about how to go about it?
One astonishing piece of advice which I've carried with me to the end, which I've passed on to a few, came from an unexpected source, Ryan Karanjawala, who I had known for a long time. And he says, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell you two things. So I said, Ryan, go right ahead. He said, remember this, that when in doubt, grant relief. And if you really can't decide, roll it over for 48 hours, something will occur to you. He was dead on right, because the first builds confidence in your court as one where relief is not always out of reach. Second, implicit in that statement is the understanding that if you grant relief, you can roll it back. But if you refuse relief, it's very difficult to undo that refusal. And the 48-hour thing is actually magical because it works 10 times out of 10. Something does always occur to you. New doors open, new pathways are found, and you find a solution to the problem, which is what this is all about to begin with.
Describe those early days as a judge.
Oh, well, it start with the night before, 19th of June 2013. And Abhay Oak, I had that assignment with Abhay Oak. So I was very excited because tremendous privilege and so on. What I did not realize that the man has a mischievous side to him. And he managed to send those 7 hulking bags, 70, 80 odd cases. And the registry said, these are for tomorrow. For tomorrow, 80. I've never read so much in my life. I was plowing through them till at some point or the other, Malu says, now look, enough, tomorrow's a big day.
At 3 a.m.
At 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. or something like this. So pack it in. So I did. He's chuckling next day, saying, how many did you read? So I said, about 45. He said, well, I've stopped at 35. A naughty fellow. Anyway, and it's a very peculiar thing. So there's this excitement to do this oath. By the way, when you do the oath, you have to rehearse it.
So that
They give you a sheet with where you're going to pause and so on. So you just practice this. You don't fumble the ball there.
Yeah, how embarrassing would that be?
That's correct. And then you get into court. You don't raise the head of the Chief Justice, for example. Then you get into court. And this is what I describe as the fishbowl experience. It's really, really strange because you're on the other side of the glass. You've spent 25 years or more looking at these two people up there. Suddenly you're one of those two people and there's 400 eyes looking at you. It's unnerving. And then friends at the bar who've been friends, supporters. I remember Saleh Doctor, to whom I was also quite close, came and sat there in front, and Abhay Oaks asked me, what is he doing in the court? I said, I don't think he's doing anything. I think he's just watching me. Inspecting. So, but it is unnerving because you realize very quickly that you're being tested. You're being evaluated from...
And judged, sir.
And judged.
Your piece, Wielding the Gavel, the view from the other side, which I think is a really wonderful description of what it means for somebody to be thrown into this whole judgeship experience. You wrote this. All of it is really problem solving, and that process of taking opposing views, of weighing them and taking a decision is one that I find enlivening and enriching. It is the best thing I have done. And I have enjoyed nothing more than what I do now.
So this was, I think, 2014 or so, that article.
Just pretty close, pretty soon after you became a judge.
2024, 10 years, 11 years down the road, I'm telling you, all of that is true till the day I retired. If you ask me whether you'd do it again, I'd say yes in a heartbeat. Despite the enormous amounts of work, stress and pressure, yes.
And the 7 bags.
And the 7, more than 7 after that. Yes, the problem solving was part of it, but the technique of the problem solving, yes. And the one thing that isn't mentioned there is the sheer range of work that opened up.
Because, you do mention it in the piece.
Because you are suddenly doing things that you did not even know existed. And you've got to do them. When someone said you can't choose the work that you do, I said that's a good thing. You're able to do things about education, pension, caste certificates. I'd never heard of a caste certificate. And there's the process, the technique, which you learn by observing the senior judges closely, is also enriching, including very early on, that you've got to unlearn everything you've been doing for 25 years. You stop arguing.
New skill set.
New skill set. You ask the question, he answers it. You say, oh, is that your answer? Next point. But you don't go back and forth with that answer. And being with Justice Oak, I think he's just probably or unarguably one of the greatest judges we've ever had.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons.
Understated in the extreme.
And understated in the extreme. It's just a solid dedication to the law. It's a very interesting aside, by the way. Just before this happened, I think Justice Oak's last appearance in court was against me in that Bombay Environmental Action Group Sanjay Gandhi National Park matter before Chief Justice C.K. Thakkar's bench. And I'm very, very happy to say that he lost. So.
A standout feature of your decision-making as a judge is unquestionably the quality of the writing in your judgments. Now, I'm not even talking here about the breadth of the topics that you cover, because you often bring to those judgments elements completely outside the law, but which have a bearing.
I also got very fussy about the visual form of the writing. I experimented a lot. How the title should appear, how the appearances should be shown, what the header and the footer should be. I busted some traditional norms because I discovered that many people were, for example, reading these judgments on digital devices, mobile phones especially. And the traditional footnote, which was a superscript, you couldn't see it. So we stopped superscripting the footnote in the footnote area, so it was just more legible. Increased the white space between paragraphs and in the margins. So the judgments looked actually much bigger than they are or ought to have been. And used a more readable font, which is a more legible one, because that was one that translated well to digital devices. I think this should be standardized somewhere.
Did you proofread every judgment?
Oh, yes. And it became more and more difficult. The editing was the difficult part. The writing, all right, let me put it like this. The actual business of writing. There's a period of time in which you freeze. You're looking at a blank screen, or you're just staring at blank paper and you don't know how to start. Then you take the plunge. You have to start somewhere. So you start dictating, knowing that you'll correct it later. What comes out of it is very rough. The first pass or the second pass after that is just a cleanup of the obvious typographical errors without making any real...
I have to stop you there for a moment, because I've read like quite a few judgments, and I found with considerable triumph, hold your breath, one in maybe 5,000 pages of writing. So
what?
One error, one typographical error.
No, you're not reading closely now. There are many more. I assure you there are many more.
I thought you were going to say there is
No, there are many more. In fact, there's a very interesting trick to this. If you want to spot a typo to your writing, you have to read backwards from the end up.
Excuse me?
It works very well. Read backwards. You suddenly start seeing the typos as you read them, rather than, because your mind is racing ahead with almost predictable.
Your mind.
Mine. Yes. When I'm writing it, because I know what's coming next, so I sort of glissade over the next phrase, not stopping at the error. When you do this backwards, you spot the errors.
You have, of course, dealt with many areas of law in your judgments. I mean, you've done a wide range of commercial law. You've done, as you say, a lot of other stuff, service, etc., because you were handling different fields. But let me remind you of a few and then ask you the question. In Kunal Kamra, you struck down a provision which empowered government to direct service providers to take down material from the internet or social platforms which it considered fake. I know that there's a difference of opinion between judges. It's pending before a third judge. That's not really relevant. In Viraj Shah, you held that lookout circulars issued by public sector banks, under which persons trying to travel abroad could be prevented, could not be sustained. And you struck down the office memorandum to that extent. In Jijaba Shinde, you directed that authorities issuing eviction notices should not go by the minimum notice period prescribed, should give proper notice, and that it should not expire on a weekend so that the citizen could have recourse to court. In Sughosh Joshi, you held overruling objections by the Election Commission, which you say curiously said it was too busy, that a vacant Lok Sabha seat could not be kept simply vacant just because there was a short time left for an election, and that a by-election had to be held. In Moneywise, you refused relief to the NSE and imposed costs, heavy costs, when it attempted to restrain journalists from writing about what they claimed was wrongdoing. Let me round this off by telling you what you held in Moneywise, because I think it kind of, in a sense, sums up what I'm going to ask you. You say more and more in the name of security or reputation, we are increasingly too eager to surrender this. You're speaking of the right of freedom of speech and its sister freedoms. When we do so, we forget. We forget that these freedoms are vital to our survival and our existence as a nation, as a people. We forget that these freedoms have not come easily. They have not come cheap. They were hard won after years of sacrifice and toil and struggle. They have not been given, they have been forged. We surrender them at our peril. To me, a clear thread running through these and many others, is a fierce commitment to protecting civil liberties and, in particular, the rights of the individual against state overreach or excess. How would you describe your approach in matters of this kind?
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you're looking to point the needle of suspicion for all of this, you have to point it at the Atul Setalvads and the Janak Dwarkadases, because this was subliminally the lesson learned that Part 3 of the Constitution is something that is so vital to the continued existence of us as a civic society. You just cannot risk the slightest erosion of those rights and freedoms. We came so close during the emergency to losing the plot entirely. You cannot let that happen again, just as you cannot let the Holocaust happen again.
Do you feel that civil liberties and constitutional rights are under particular challenge at this point?
Today?
Yes.
I would say so. I would unhesitatingly say so. And in ways perhaps that are far more subtle, insidious than they used to be. Earlier in the emergency, you'd have a blanket censorship.
Yes.
You just couldn't print because that was the only medium. The internet has made that difficult to control, but there are other ways of getting to it. And when you start the silencing from within of a counter force, there are perils to the internet as well. I understand that. But when you start silencing that counterpoint, that's a slippery slope. That's a very slippery slope. And when you start affecting liberty, individual liberty, the right to stay out of jail, not to be jailed, the right to be out on bail, this is seriously problematic. More and more, you have to start questioning this. And I'm not saying this about a particular government. I'm saying this about us as a society, which is, what is it that we want to see? More and more of our society in jail and building more and more prisons? Because you are now criminalizing all kinds of things? Is this really our idea of a liberal society that is a civil society? Difficult. We've got huge problems here with illiberalism as well, of every stripe on every side of the spectrum. That has to be dealt with. These are difficult questions for the future. But ultimately, the constitutional principles must remain intact. And a fundamental misconception there, Shiraz, is to see your fundamental rights, whether they're under 14, 19, 21, as something that's a gift. It's not. No government gave it to us. That's contrary to the first 3 words of the Constitution in the preamble. So,
there have certainly been some who have sometimes taken the rough end of your tongue in matter X or Y. And perhaps it's not in every case that an apology was given. Is there anything you would like to say on that?
it's not something I'm proud of. It's something I'm deeply, deeply ashamed of. And I would like to apologize for those. It happened. It shouldn't have happened. It's against every accepted or known principle of good judgeship The one or two cases where I knew I'd really gone over the edge, I was lucky enough. Well, I made it a point to try and make amends as best I could. But there again, I didn't do it in chambers because I felt that if this happened in court, the rectification or the correction must also happen in court and not in chambers. But there have been other incidents, but there's really no excuse. It's not an answer to say I never carried it forward to the next matter or anything of that kind. It should just never have happened.
What is your take on the whole aspect of courts going virtual and paperless?
I think the Bombay High Court's being much too lenient administratively about moving to digital platforms. We are being far too lax with lawyers being granted extensions and exemptions in e-filing. You have to do this with a cutoff date. And I think the judges must be driven, if not compelled, to actually make the shift.
Yeah, so that's my question. Do you think it has now become a necessary part of a judge's qualification to be a judge?
I think it's not acceptable any longer for a judge to say, I'm unfamiliar with computers and I don't know. I'll
do it.
Proceed on the own system. I don't think that's acceptable any longer. It is fundamentally, as our Chief Justice has been saying, others have been saying as well, really a question of not just access to justice as a phrase, but for whom are we doing this? It can't be only... Look, I'm not saying I'm not a votary of streaming, live streaming, of broadcasting this on YouTube, because I maintain, and I've written this in the judgment, that what we do is serious business. It's not entertainment. That's one aspect. But COVID taught me this, and I know this because I think mine was the first court to go out on the 9th of April, 2020, on Zoom. Through that period, I had this experience, and I'm sure many of my colleagues did. People would phone in or join in from the remotest places. Two, I remember, stand in memory. One, a lawyer was on a motorcycle somewhere going through Kutch, and he said, Lordship, I'm in Kutch. I said, okay. He says, my client has returned to the village. I'm on my way there to take instructions. Could we do this 2 days later? And I just thought this was incredible. It was just marvelous. There was another person who was doing exactly the same thing, going through some forests in Telangana, and had traveled from Pune to there to try and get instructions so that the matter could progress. How would we have done it if we didn't have digital platforms? These matters would have collapsed. They got resolved.
What is your view on the use of AI in the judiciary?
People have forgotten artificial intelligence as opposed to what? Natural stupidity. Its great advantage is in pattern detection. The more data you give it, the more accurately it discerns patterns, and using those patterns estimates or predicts outcomes. It can't decide. It can predict likely outcomes. You have to use this with some caution, and you have to use this more aggressively in administrative matters. You can use it to determine patterns of what kind of filing is happening where do you need more judges, what are the causes for delays. You can take all kinds of administrative decisions based on intelligently constructed AI-driven answers. That's yet to happen.
How would you like to be remembered as a judge?
Can I say I'd like to be forgotten?
I rather thought you might.
Leaf in the wind.
Thank you for everything that you have done for our court as a judge. Thank you for doing everything you could with everything you had. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and it's been an honor.